the liberal camp essentially decided to uphold austerity, to uphold public services budget cuts. And this very precisely a couple of years ago impacted the civil defense budget. And the civil defense budget, of course, includes fire services. And so this is a very clear line that we're seeing, and that's illustrating how illogical this argument that we should prioritize defense investment, military investment over everything else. It's just not true.
Europe is hot. And hotter than it's been in recent history. People have seen reports that not only is Europe facing record temperatures, but right now firefighters across France and Spain are battling some of the worst wildfires that Europe has ever seen. Tens of thousands of hectares scorched, over 200,000 people forced to evacuate in France alone, and a fresh heat wave, as I mentioned, is rolling in to make matters even worse. In Gironde, one blaze came within 15 kilometers of Bordeaux, reportedly causing devastation comparable to World War II. This is serious stuff, people. And now this is an annual ritual. Every summer, the record burns hotter than the last. And the easy story, of course, is climate change. And yes, the planet is heating up, but there's a second story that the unions and European left are trying to force into the frame. The fires are spreading because public services that fight them have also been gutted. France lost more firefighters than any country in Europe between 2021 and 2022. Its National Forestry Office went from 15,000 workers to just 8,000 workers over 4 decades. Meteo France shed a third of its staff, and Macron doubled the military budget, but the country does not have enough for water-bombing aircraft, with only 2 Canadairs due before 2033. And I emphasize Canadairs because
we're laughing about that.
We're laughing about it because it's a very cool plane that sprays water and picks up water. Learned about it this week. Shout out.
Not to be confused with Canadair.
Air Canada. Air Canada.
Air Canada. Yes.
And as Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the leader of La France Insoumise, put it, France can build the best fighter jet in the world, but somehow can't build a plane to pour water on a forest that is literally burning and threatening the lives of its citizens. So our next guest laid all of this out in a new piece for Breakthrough News. We're joined by Ana Vračar, who wrote the piece. Ana, welcome.
Hi.
How's it going? Well, you are in Croatia right now, where I assume it is also pretty hot.
It is. Yeah.
Facing those heat waves. But Ana, your piece that you wrote this week for Breakthrough News connects the fires directly to neoliberalism, not just climate change, which in a way is also a product of neoliberalism. But what made you want to tell the story in that way, and what's happening on the ground in France and Spain and other countries in Europe right now?
Well, I guess it's pretty much connected to how you started. And, in Europe, for the past couple of years, at least, we've been hearing about how it's one of the regions that warming up the fastest, and how the situation is critical, and we're seeing health effects of climate change and of the heat waves and of the fires. But essentially, what it's being framed as something that's completely apolitical and that completely does not depend on what the governments are doing on the ground, when in fact it has pretty much everything to do what they're doing and the choices that they're making. So when we talk about the fires that are happening now, of course they're big and they're unprecedented. But it's also worth noting that for the last, I don't know how many years, essentially every year they've been unprecedented. At every year it keeps getting worse. Now, what's worrying in all this situation is that nobody actually seems to be more prepared each year that it happens. So it's kind of shocking to see how essentially the messaging is all there, and formally when you listen to Macron, or you listen to the European leaders, they have it all right on climate change, but when it comes down to acting, they essentially don't do much or anything at all.
I mean, it's just completely insane and actually infuriating when you look at the kind of numbers here. You know, the through line in your reporting is austerity, right? So can you walk us through some of the numbers you dug up in terms of the vanishing firefighters, the gutted forestry service, the missing Canadairs? How directly can you draw the line from these cuts to the scale of the destruction?
Well, I think the trade unions have been drawing this very clear line for years now, and only if you look only at the reports that the European trade unions of public services have been putting out, the warnings that they have been putting out on firefighters, it's pretty shocking again, because we're talking about something that's again formally being recognized as something that's very important for Europe as a whole, as a political union, whatever they call it, whatever they want to call it. At the same time, we're seeing either a fall or a stagnation of both the money that's being directed towards the sector, but also in the number of firefighters that are there. And just to keep to Spain, to keep to France, because it's been it's been top of the news these days. What they've seen in 2021 and 2022, according to the European Federation of Public Services Unions. Essentially, they've been the worst hit. They've seen the largest drop in firefighters number in the whole of the European Union. But then if you look at the other countries as well, and what's interesting here and what's worrying here is that we're talking about the Mediterranean countries in Europe, which are also at very high risk of this kind of wildfires. Portugal, Cyprus, Croatia, Romania. So all the countries that actually we would expect them to need firefighters at some point, they've also seen either drops or stagnations of the number. And it's not that maybe they're just actively cutting the people who are working in those services. They're also not replacing the people who are retiring. So this is one part of the equation. But the other part, which is also quite interesting and quite worrying, is that we're seeing also a drop in the number of people working in the services that should support fire emergency response. We're talking about meteorological services. We're talking about forestry services, and as Zoe mentioned in the introduction, of course, just in France, these services have seen again thousands and thousands of people being dropped.
I mean, Ana, another thing that you have reported a lot on for Breakthrough News and previously for People's Dispatch is the remilitarization of Europe. And, the line that you highlighted in this article from Jean-Luc Mélenchon about fighter jets versus the water bombers really lands and is just a through line exactly following, of course, the NATO summit and the other summits of European leaders just pledging to do whatever they can to try to meet that 5% GDP goal. And in the article you cited Macron doubling the military budget while the frontline services shrank. So what does that guns versus firefighters trade-off tell us about the priorities of European states right now?
I would say, the quote illustrates perfectly what most people in Europe are thinking, that water bomber is essentially the only bomber plane that we need. And it's the only bomber that's not getting, that essentially is the only type of airplane that we're not seeing materialize here. But I think, that quote captures quite well what the left and what the anti-war movement in Europe has been saying for the past years, and that the logic that the European leaders are proposing is not working. So it does not stand essentially that this kind of reindustrialization through military might that they're proposing, it won't have a good impact on people. It will not spill over to the working class and make millions of jobs and make sure that people can eat and essentially walk on the street without being burned or without inhaling toxic smoke. That's not going to work. So essentially, what we're seeing through the response to the fires, but also as we see in the response to a lot of other extreme events. So a couple of years ago, it was the floods. Every now and then we get like really extreme storms in different parts of Europe. So essentially, the whole weather it's getting more extreme. It's impacting more directly the everyday lives of people. And these are the things that the progressives and the movements they want to address, but there is no space for this in the public budgets that are being shaped by the current leadership. And so maybe just to come back to the Canadair question from before. So what Mélenchon also talks about, what La France Insoumise talks about a lot these days, is how previous governments, how previous administrations, also linked to Macron's liberal camp, have essentially prepared the ground for what we're seeing now. Because it was during Macron's presidency that the French people have been promised many other water bombers to be purchased exactly for reasons like this. They have not seen them delivered. They actually have not seen them even purchased, maybe a fraction of the total number that was promised. And that was partly because the liberal camp essentially decided to uphold austerity, to uphold public services budget cuts. And this very precisely a couple of years ago impacted the civil defense budget. And the civil defense budget, of course, includes fire services. And so this is a very clear line that we're seeing, and that's illustrating how illogical this argument that we should prioritize defense investment, military investment over everything else. It's just not true.
You know, you also point to something quite deep and even deeper, I would say, than the emergency response here in your piece, which is like the land itself, in the sense that, you know, unions have been flagging monoculture and this kind of forest profitability schemes that are making the landscape actually more flammable to begin with. So can you talk a little bit about how the capitalist management of nature is also helping to manufacture these conditions?
Yeah, of course. I think that's an incredibly important point, and it shows, you know, just much how this set of neoliberal policies of the austerity measures that's been implemented essentially makes the system. It's not that we're talking just about this, that we're talking explicitly, so just about the attacks on public services. We're also discussing about how this is spilling over to the impacts of other cuts. Of course, that the changes, so the management of forestry has been, well, in many places in the Balkans, in Eastern Europe, at least, I think we can openly say criminal, because it's just pure extraction. It's not done for any kind of benefit for the local population. It's not done for the purpose of developing a local industry. It's done essentially to cut down the forests and then bring the wood to be manufactured and processed in other countries more west in Europe. So, but we're also seeing this happening in other parts of our environment. We're seeing very significant popular struggles around water. Water again in Eastern Europe, which surprisingly has a lot of water, and that's kind of good in this current conditions. But it's also being manipulated and sold off in different ways. So we're seeing, you know, a lot of foreign investors coming in, recognizing how beautiful the you know, it's the terms that they like to use. It's very beautiful. It's very natural. It should be used. It should be, you know, monetized in one or another way. So on the one hand, it can be water extraction and building all this kind of small hydroelectric plants, then disrupt how the local communities can live, and how much access they can have to water, and how they can use the rivers that they've been, you know, they've lived with for very long. But on the other hand, you know, we're also seeing examples like in Albania, and the lengths to which this can come, where essentially you have a government that's ready to sell off a complete natural park just because it pays off. So it has, it speaks a lot about, again, of the priorities that the governments have made for themselves, and it's definitely not the benefit of the people who live in these places.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because just several years ago, Europe kind of was the center of this rejuvenation of the climate movement. We had Greta Thunberg, who led the Fridays for the Future. It really seemed like there was all this enthusiasm behind saving the environment, and yet European leaders who are all about the green energy, the climate funds, all of this, clearly have not put any weight behind this proposal. And it's interesting. I'm really glad that you brought up this question of water extraction, because on numerous occasions, military advisors, conservative think tanks have pointed to the fact that the coming wars are going to be over water, and that water is very quickly becoming one of the most important resources as we see the planet burning. And of course, water is necessary for all sorts of mineral processing, data centers, etc. So definitely we have to keep an eye on this. And just before we let you go, Ana, just wanted to get your last comment on, this question of the EU. It straddles this kind of liberal line, like, yeah, we're going to push for climate transition, all of this, but at the same time, it's driving this austerity. So what does it look to actually push for a full break from the neoliberal model that fuels climate change and these fires?
Well, I mean, Europe, I think that essentially I'm trying to find another word and not say that they lie, but they definitely act not in line with what they're saying. And I think that, one of the important things that to remember when we address this question is that if they actually wanted to do something concrete on this, then they would start by not eroding the labor and the environmental protections that they had put in place just because they figured that it would suit the defense industry at this point. And this is something that the far right and the right wing in the European Parliament did very, very recently. So essentially, it's of course, then the far right would say that they're very climate skeptic and that they would just put air conditioning everywhere and it would solve the problem. But again, not. It's essentially what they're doing on the everyday level that matters and that points to their priorities. On the other hand, when we talk about alternatives, and I think that in the past years we have definitely heard more and more, a bit more convincing solutions being tabled or at least being discussed. I mean, a lot of people have framed this as also a question of deprivatization and privatization. If we keep to water, for example, we know that in Britain there has been a long and difficult discussion about how water services were privatized, how they should be returned. What's the impact of this privatization of water? When we talk about climate, we cannot not talk about housing. The European Union is again talking about the housing crisis, but it's not really talking about how it's going to solve it and who's going to be in charge of it, who's going to lead it. Is it going to be the people, the construction industry that has contributed quite significantly to the high temperatures that Europeans have been coping with over the past years, or is it going to be addressed in another way? And what we're seeing from people on the ground, what we're also seeing from the left options on the ground, is a larger openness to discussing this with the communities who are being impacted. So this is something I think that's going to be at least an important factor in how this conversation continues. So how people are going to have a say over what happens with the forests that they live near to, or with the river, or with how the housing is air conditioned or not air conditioned, maybe does not need air conditioning because it has a garden and maybe a bit more temperate temperatures.
Well, yeah, it seems like air conditioning all over Europe is not going to necessarily solve the problem of climate change, perhaps. But Ana, thank you so much for joining us here in BT Live. We will be back with you soon. Have to dig into this question of the remilitarization of Europe, so we will be turning to you again soon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Bye.